What if the Bible has a hidden pattern nobody ever told you? A pattern so precise, it changes everything you thought you understood. And once you see it, you will never read Scripture the same. Because this is not theory, this is structure woven into the text. The very first sentence of the Bible contains exactly 7 words. Not 6, not 8, exactly 7, placed with intentional design. And right at the center sits a word you never even notice. A word that disappears completely when translated into modern English Bibles. Yet in Hebrew, it stands quietly, connecting the beginning and the end. That is not a coincidence. That is a signal hidden in plain sight. Because from Genesis to Revelation, one number keeps appearing again. 7 shows up in moments that seem ordinary until you look closer. And every time it appears, it carries the same deeper meaning. Not random repetition, not decoration, but a message about completion itself. This is where most people miss what the Bible is actually saying. They read the stories, but they never see the pattern underneath. And that pattern reveals something about how God works through time. Because in the original language, 7 is more than just a number. It is tied to promise, to fulfillment, to something fully brought to completion. Which means every time you see 7, something is being finished. Something is reaching the exact point it was always meant to reach. And that changes how you see every story you thought you knew. Because suddenly, nothing feels random. Everything feels intentionally connected. And if that is true, then this pattern is not just ancient history. It might be telling you something about your life right now. About the moments that feel incomplete, unfinished, or painfully unresolved. Because what if the story is not over? It is just not complete. And what if the same pattern written into Scripture still applies today? Because once you understand what 7 really means, everything shifts. And what comes next will show you why this pattern matters more. Because to understand the pattern, you have to understand the language. And this is where everything begins to shift in a powerful way. In Hebrew, the word for 7 is pronounced very closely, Sheva. But Sheva does not just mean a number you can simply count. It comes from a root that also means to swear a binding oath. The same exact letters carry both meanings without any separation at all. 7 and oath are not related ideas. They are the same idea. To swear an oath was to bind yourself completely to a promise that could not be broken, reversed, or walked away from. And there is another meaning hidden inside the very same root word. It also means fullness, satisfaction, reaching a state of having enough, completion, promise, satisfaction, all connected through one single linguistic source. No modern language carries that kind of layered meaning inside a number. Which means when ancient readers heard 7, they heard something deeper. They did not hear counting. They heard commitment and completion happening together. And once you see this, the Bible stops feeling random or disconnected. It starts to feel structured, intentional, almost like a designed system unfolding. Every appearance of 7 becomes a signal that something is reaching fulfillment. Not partial progress, not almost done, but fully completed by design. And this is where the hidden meaning begins to reveal its power. Because if 7 means oath, then completion is tied to a promise. God is not just finishing things, He is finishing what He declared. What He started was never meant to remain incomplete or unresolved forever. And suddenly, the pattern is not just theological, it becomes deeply personal. Because it raises a question most people are not ready to ask. What if the delays in your life are not failures at all? What if they are part of a process moving toward completion? Because in this pattern, nothing is random. Everything is moving somewhere specific. And that realization sets the stage for where the pattern first appears. Because once you return to the beginning, you will see it clearly. Now go back to the beginning, because that is where everything starts. Not just the story of creation, but the structure behind reality itself. In Genesis, God creates the world across 6 carefully ordered days: light, sky, land, stars, animals, and finally humanity placed within creation. Each day ends with a rhythm repeated again and again consistently. Evening comes, then morning follows, marking time moving forward with purpose. But when the 7th day arrives, something unexpected quietly changes everything. There is no evening. There is no closing statement to end it. The pattern breaks, and the silence becomes part of the message. Because the 7th day was never meant to be just another day. It was a declaration that everything needed had already been completed. God did not stop because he was tired or lacking strength. He stopped because nothing else needed to be added or improved further. The work had reached its perfect, intended state of completion and fullness. And then something happens that never happened in the previous 6 days. God blesses the 7th day and sets it apart as holy time. Before temples existed, before rituals, before laws, time itself became sacred. The 7th day becomes the first thing in Scripture called holy ever. Which means holiness was never about places first. It was about completion. Completion is what transforms something ordinary into something set apart and sacred. And here is where the insight becomes deeper than most expect. If the 7th day never ends, then that rest is still open. It is not just a past event, it is an ongoing invitation. An invitation into a state where everything is already fully finished. And this changes how you see struggle, effort, and unfinished moments today. Because maybe rest is not something you reach after exhaustion finally arrives. Maybe rest is what happens when something is finally brought to completion. And if that is true, then the pattern of 7 carries forward. Because what began in creation does not stay contained in Genesis alone. It begins to echo through history in ways impossible to ignore. And then something remarkable happens. The pattern does not stay in creation. It begins to echo through history in moments that seem ordinary at first. The story of Noah is where the pattern quietly reappears again. After the flood, the waters begin to recede across the broken earth. The world has been reset. Everything familiar has been wiped away. And Noah is waiting, watching, trying to understand what happens next. He releases a dove to search for any sign of dry land. The dove returns, and nothing has changed in that first attempt. So Noah waits again. Not hours, not moments, but 7 full days. Then he sends the dove out again, hoping for a different result. This time it returns with an olive leaf, a sign of life. But the process is not finished. The world is not fully restored yet. So Noah waits another 7 days before sending the dove again. And on that 7th interval, the dove does not return anymore, because the process has finally reached its point of completion. The pattern is the same, just like in the original creation account. 7 marks the moment where something broken becomes whole again. The reset of the world follows the exact rhythm of creation itself. This is not coincidence. This is structure repeating across different moments. The same design that formed the world is now restoring it again. And if you look closely, the pattern carries a deeper implication. progress does not always look visible in the early stages of waiting. The first release showed nothing. The second only showed partial change. But the completion was always tied to the full cycle of 7, which means what looks like delay might actually be alignment in progress. Because the system is not based on human urgency or impatience, it is based on a rhythm that moves toward completion with precision. And once you start recognizing this, it changes how you interpret waiting. Because waiting is not empty when it is part of a larger pattern. And what looks like silence may actually be movement you cannot see. Which leads to a deeper question that most people avoid asking. What if the waiting in your life is not wasted time at all? What if it is part of a process designed to bring something complete? Because this pattern does not just apply to events on a global scale, it moves into individual lives in ways that feel far more personal. And this is where the pattern becomes deeply personal and impossible to ignore. Because it no longer plays out in nations, it plays out in lives. The story of Jacob reveals how this pattern moves through human experience. Jacob falls in love and agrees to work 7 years to marry Rachel. 7 long years filled with labor, anticipation, and emotional expectation building. But at the end, he is deceived and given Leah instead. Everything he waited for seems delayed, broken, and completely out of place. So he agrees to work another 7 years for Rachel again. 14 years of waiting for something that felt promised from the start. And this is where the pattern reveals something most people overlook. The promise was never denied, but the process was longer than expected. The delay was not a failure, it was part of the design unfolding. Because in this pattern, completion does not always follow human timelines. It follows a structure that moves toward fulfillment with exact precision. Jacob's story is not just about love. It is about transformation through waiting. Those 14 years shape him into someone completely different than before. The man who started is not the man who finally receives the promise, which means the waiting was not empty, it was actively shaping him. And this introduces a powerful principle that applies far beyond this story. Sometimes the process exists not just to deliver something to you. It exists to prepare you to become someone who can receive it. Because if the promise arrived too early, it would not be sustainable. Completion requires alignment, not just timing or external circumstances alone. And this is where most people misinterpret what delay really means. They see delay as rejection when it might actually be preparation. They see waiting as stagnation when it could be hidden progress unfolding. Because in the pattern of 7, nothing is wasted or meaningless. Every cycle moves something closer to its intended point of completion. And if you miss that, you may walk away too early. You may stop at 6, thinking nothing is ever going to change. But the pattern shows that transformation often happens at the end. And what looks like nothing happening may be everything aligning beneath surface. Which raises an even bigger realization about how this pattern scales. Because it does not stop with individuals, it expands into entire systems. And this is where the pattern expands beyond individuals into entire systems. Because what governs a single life now begins to shape whole nations. The story of Joseph reveals how 7 controls economic and global outcomes. Pharaoh has a dream that no one in Egypt can understand or explain. 7 healthy cows rise from the river, followed by 7 thin ones. Then 7 full ears of grain appear, followed by 7 empty ones. The pattern is clear, but the meaning is hidden beneath the surface. Joseph is called in, and he reveals what the dream truly means. 7 years of abundance will come, followed by 7 years of famine. A complete cycle of provision, followed by a complete cycle of testing. And this is where the pattern moves from symbol into strategy. Because Joseph does not just interpret, he provides a precise solution. Store during the 7 years of abundance, prepare for the coming famine. Manage resources wisely because the cycle is already set in motion. This is not prediction. This is alignment with a system already established. And because Joseph understands the pattern, he is placed into leadership. The one who sees the structure becomes the one who preserves nations. Egypt survives, and surrounding regions are saved because of this insight. And here is where the realization becomes even more powerful than before. The pattern of 7 is not just symbolic, it is deeply practical. It governs timing, preparation, and decision-making at the highest level. Because when you understand the cycle, you stop reacting emotionally to change. You begin to move strategically, aligning yourself with what is coming next. And this is where most people fail to recognize what is happening. They celebrate in abundance without preparing for what follows after it. Or they panic in famine without remembering that cycles eventually shift again. But the pattern reveals that both seasons are part of one design. Abundance is not permanent, and neither is lack or hardship forever. Each phase exists within a structure moving toward a defined completion. And if you understand that, your perspective begins to shift dramatically. You stop seeing life as random events and start seeing structured movement. Because even what feels chaotic may actually follow a hidden order. And once that realization sets in, it changes how you face uncertainty. Because the question is no longer if something will change, but when. And that understanding prepares you for the moment when the pattern intensifies. And then the pattern reaches a moment where it can no longer hide. It steps into the spotlight in a way that feels impossible to ignore. The city is Jericho, fortified, closed, and completely prepared for defense. No weakness in the walls, no entry points, no visible strategy available. From a human perspective, this situation looks completely impossible to overcome. But what happens next breaks every expectation of how victory should work. God gives Joshua a plan that makes no logical sense at all. March around the city once each day for 6 consecutive days. No attack, no weapons used, no visible progress made during those days. Just walking in silence, repeating the same action again and again. And for most people, this is where doubt would begin to grow, because nothing changes after the first day or the second day. By the third, fourth, even the 6th day, the walls still stand. No cracks, no movement, no sign that anything is actually happening. But then comes the 7th day, and everything begins to escalate. 7 priests carry 7 trumpets and move before the ark. They march around the city, not once, but 7 full times. The repetition intensifies. The pattern becomes impossible to ignore now. And then, at the exact moment the cycle reaches completion, it happens. The trumpets sound, the people shout, and the walls collapse instantly. No battle, no force, no gradual breakdown, just immediate, total completion. And this is where the meaning of the pattern becomes undeniable. The victory was not produced by the action of the people. It was revealed at the moment the pattern reached its completion point. God had already declared the outcome before the process even began. The marching was not creating the result. It was aligning with it. Which means the completion existed before the visible breakthrough appeared. And this changes how you interpret effort, delay, and repeated actions. Because sometimes what looks like pointless repetition is actually alignment. Each step may feel identical, but it is moving toward a fixed outcome. The difference between nothing happening and everything changing can be one step, and most people never reach that moment because they stop too early. They walk away on day 5 or day 6 when nothing looks different. But the pattern shows that transformation often happens at the very end, which raises a question that becomes difficult to ignore moving forward. What if your breakthrough is not far away, but simply unfinished? Because what comes next reveals how close people often come to completion. And this is where the pattern becomes dangerously personal for most people, because it reveals the exact moment where people usually choose to quit. The story of Naaman shows how close someone can come to breakthrough. Naaman is a powerful commander, respected, successful, yet carrying a disease. Leprosy covers his skin, something no power or status can fix. He is told by the prophet to wash in the Jordan River, not once, not twice, but 7 times in the same water. And immediately, the instruction feels too simple to be meaningful. No dramatic ritual, no complex process, nothing that feels worthy of healing. Naaman hesitates, frustrated, almost offended by the simplicity of the solution. Because most people expect transformation to look impressive from the outside. But real transformation often hides inside simple, repeated, uncomfortable actions. Still, he chooses to obey and steps into the river the first time. Nothing changes. His skin remains exactly the same as before. He goes down a second time, then a third. Still no visible difference. By the 4th and 5th, frustration begins to build even stronger. Because effort is happening, but results are nowhere to be seen. Then comes the 6th time, and still, absolutely nothing has changed. And this is the moment where most people would walk away, because 6 looks exactly like 1, like 2, like every attempt before. It feels pointless, repetitive, almost like nothing is ever going to shift. But Naaman chooses to go down one more time anyway, and on the 7th, everything changes in a single moment. His skin is restored, completely healed, like the skin of a child. No gradual improvement, no partial result, just full and instant completion. And this is where the pattern becomes impossible to ignore again. The breakthrough was not building slowly, it was waiting for completion. Everything before the 7th looked exactly the same without any progress, which means the difference between nothing and everything was one step. And that step is the one most people never take, because they stop at 6, convinced that nothing is ever happening. They confuse lack of visible change with lack of actual progress. But the pattern shows that progress can exist without visible evidence. It can be building beneath the surface, moving toward a fixed moment. And when that moment arrives, everything shifts instantly and completely. Which raises a question that becomes impossible to ignore any longer. How many people are one step away from everything changing right now? And this is where the pattern moves from events into an entire system. Because it is no longer about isolated stories, it becomes structured design. God builds an entire calendar for His people based on the number 7. Not random holidays, but appointed times designed with precision and meaning. 7 feasts are established across the year, each carrying specific significance. Passover, unleavened bread, first fruits, weeks, trumpets, atonement, and tabernacles. They are not cultural traditions, they are divine appointments set in motion. Moments where people are meant to encounter God within a structured rhythm. And the pattern is not only visible in yearly cycles of celebration, it is embedded into the land itself through agricultural rhythms and rest. Every seventh year, the land is commanded to rest completely. No planting, no harvesting, no striving, just allowing restoration to happen. The same principle seen in creation now applied to an entire nation. Rest is not optional. It is part of the system of completion. Because constant production without rest breaks the intended design of life. And this reveals something deeper about how the system actually works. Completion requires cycles, not endless effort or continuous pressure to produce. And then the pattern expands even further into something even more powerful. 7 cycles of 7 years lead to a moment called Jubilee. 49 years pass, and then the 50th year resets everything. Debts are canceled, slaves are freed, land returns to original owners. Everything that was lost is restored back to its rightful place. This is not just symbolic, it is a complete economic reset. A system designed to prevent permanent loss and endless accumulation of damage. Which means the pattern of 7 is not abstract or theoretical. It directly impacts how people live, work, recover, and rebuild their lives. It ensures that broken systems are not allowed to stay broken forever, because built into the structure is a moment where everything is restored. And that changes how you view loss, failure, and long-term hardship. Because within this system, nothing broken is meant to stay broken permanently. There is always a built-in moment where restoration becomes possible again. And if that is true, then the pattern is not just ancient history. It is a blueprint that reveals how restoration is meant to happen. Which leads to a moment where someone claims that reset has arrived. And this is where the pattern reaches one of its most powerful expressions. Because everything built into the system now leads to a single moment. That moment is called Jubilee, and it changes everything instantly. After 7 cycles of 7 years, the 50th year is declared, not as continuation, but as a complete reset across the entire nation. Debts that once defined people are completely canceled without negotiation. Slaves who lost freedom are released and restored to their families again. Land that was sold under pressure returns to its original rightful owners. Everything that drifted away is pulled back into its intended alignment. This is not partial repair. This is full restoration by design. And what makes this moment even more powerful is its timing. It does not happen randomly. It happens after a complete cycle finishes, which means restoration is not accidental. It is built into the system. The system anticipates loss, failure, and imbalance before they even occur, and it provides a guaranteed moment where everything can be restored again. This changes how you understand long-term struggle and delayed outcomes, because what looks permanent may actually be waiting for its reset moment. What feels lost may not be gone, just temporarily out of place. And this idea would have felt radical, even unbelievable at that time. A system where no failure becomes permanent and no loss becomes final. A system where restoration is not optional, but inevitable by design. And this is where the pattern begins to point beyond itself, because it starts to feel like something bigger is being prepared. Like the system is not just describing cycles, but pointing to fulfillment. Because imagine hearing this and realizing something incredible at the same time. What if the reset is not just a year, but a person? What if restoration is not just a system, but an arrival? Because eventually, someone steps into history and makes that exact claim. Not symbolically, not indirectly, but clearly and unmistakably in public. And when that happens, everything about the pattern begins to converge. Because the system was never the final destination, it was preparation. Preparation for the moment when completion would take human form itself. And once that happens, the meaning of everything changes permanently, which leads to the point where all patterns finally come together. And this is the moment where every pattern finally begins to converge. Because everything that came before was pointing toward a single person. Not a concept, not a system, but someone stepping directly into history. Jesus does not appear randomly. He arrives at a precise moment. A moment that aligns perfectly with the pattern built across centuries. And once he begins speaking, the pattern becomes impossible to ignore. He makes 7 declarations that all begin with the same phrase. I am the bread of life, the one who satisfies completely. I am the light of the world, revealing truth in total clarity. I am the door, the entry point into something fully restored. I am the good shepherd, guiding and protecting without failure. I am the resurrection and the life, overcoming death completely. I am the way, the truth, and the life itself. I am the true vine, the source from which everything flows. 7 statements, each revealing a complete aspect of who he is. Not partial identity, not fragments, but a full picture of fulfillment. And alongside these words, there are signs that reinforce the pattern. Miracles that unfold in a sequence, each building toward a final revelation. Water becomes wine. Sickness is healed. Blindness is completely restored. Thousands are fed. Storms are silenced. And even death is reversed. Each moment revealing not just power, but completion in action. And this is where the meaning of the pattern becomes unmistakable. Jesus is not just participating in the pattern, he embodies it fully. He represents the completion that everything else was pointing toward. The system, the stories, the cycles, all lead to this moment. Because the pattern was never about repetition, it was about arrival. Arrival of someone who fulfills what was promised from the beginning. And this changes how you interpret everything that came before. Because now the pattern is not abstract, it is personal and present. It is no longer something to study, it is someone to encounter. And once that realization settles in, the story moves toward its peak. Because everything that has been building now approaches its defining moment. A moment where completion will not just be implied, but declared openly. And when that declaration happens, it will change everything permanently. And then comes the moment everything has been moving toward from beginning. Not a theory, not a symbol, but a real moment in history. Jesus is on the cross, and everything seems to be falling apart. From the outside, it looks like failure, like the story is ending. But what happens next reveals the true meaning behind the pattern. Across the Gospels, Jesus speaks 7 final statements before his death. Each word carries weight, each moment moving closer toward completion. He speaks forgiveness, promise, care, abandonment, thirst, and then something powerful. The 6th statement is short, but it carries everything inside it. He says, "It is finished." And the meaning is deeper than expected. The original word means completed, fulfilled, brought exactly to its intended end. Not partially done, not interrupted, but fully accomplished with precision. This is not the voice of defeat. It is the voice of completion. Everything that was promised, everything that was building, now reaches fulfillment. And then comes the seventh statement: quiet, deliberate, and completely different. He commits his spirit into the hands of the Father peacefully. Not chaos, not confusion, but a moment of rest after completion. 6 moments of work, followed by 1 moment of surrender and rest. The same rhythm seen in creation now appears again at the cross. The structure is identical. The meaning is impossible to ignore now. Completion is followed by rest, just as it was from the beginning. And this reveals something that changes how you see everything else. The cross was not an interruption. It was the intended point of completion. The suffering was not random. It was part of a designed process. Because everything was moving toward this exact moment all along, and when the statement is spoken, the pattern reaches its peak. What was hidden in Genesis is now declared openly before everyone. What was structured quietly is now spoken clearly in one sentence. "It is finished" means nothing is left incomplete or unresolved anymore. And that statement carries forward beyond that single moment in history, because completion at the cross sets the stage for something even bigger. Something that expands beyond one event into the entire future of creation. And once you see that, the story does not end at the cross. It continues into a vision where everything is brought to completion again. And just when you think the story has reached its final conclusion, it expands beyond one moment into the full scope of all creation. The book of Revelation reveals the pattern on a global, cosmic scale. 7 churches are addressed, representing the complete body of believers. 7 seals are opened, unveiling the unfolding plan of history itself. 7 trumpets sound, announcing transitions that move everything forward. 7 bowls are poured, bringing the process toward its final completion. This is not repetition for effect. This is progression toward a destination. Each sequence builds upon the last, moving closer to a final moment. A moment where everything broken is finally restored and made whole. And at the climax of this vision, a voice speaks again clearly. The words echo what was spoken earlier, but now at a greater scale. It is done. A declaration that everything has reached completion, again. Not just one event, but all of creation brought into fulfillment. The same message spoken at the cross now covers everything that exists. From beginning to end, the pattern has remained perfectly consistent. What started in Genesis is now fully realized in this final vision: creation, redemption, restoration, all following the same structured rhythm. And this reveals something that changes how you see the entire story. History is not random. It is moving toward a defined point of completion. Every moment, every event, every delay fits within a larger design. And once you understand that, uncertainty begins to lose its power. Because what feels chaotic may actually be part of a precise system. A system that has been moving toward completion from the very beginning. And this realization begins to shift from theory into something personal. Because if the pattern governs all things, it includes your life too. Which leads to a moment where the message becomes deeply personal. A moment where the pattern stops being observed and starts being felt. And this is where the pattern stops being distant and becomes personal. Because it is one thing to see it in scripture and history. It is another thing entirely to recognize it inside your own life. There was a woman who spent years praying for her son. Not days, not weeks, but years with no visible change at all. She prayed in silence, in doubt, in moments where nothing responded. No signs, no progress, no indication that anything was actually happening. And over time, the silence began to feel like a closed door, like her prayers were not reaching anywhere beyond the ceiling above. She started to question if anything would ever truly change again, because when nothing moves, it feels like nothing is being done. But what she could not see was everything moving beneath the surface. Conversations were happening, thoughts were shifting, moments were aligning quietly. And then something unexpected began to unfold within a single week. A conversation with an old friend he had not spoken to returned. A song played that forced him to stop and actually reflect deeply. A passage of scripture appeared that he had not read in years. And suddenly, everything that looked disconnected began to converge together. He called her, and his voice carried something she had waited for. Not a small change, not partial progress, but something completely different. In a single moment, everything shifted in a way she never expected. And later she said something that captures the pattern perfectly clear. I thought nothing was happening, but everything was happening the entire time. And this is where the meaning of the pattern becomes undeniable again, because what looks like silence may actually be hidden alignment in progress. What feels like delay may actually be movement you cannot yet see. Because in every story, the early moments rarely show visible change. The first steps often look exactly like the ones before them. But that does not mean nothing is happening beneath the surface. It means the process has not yet reached its point of completion. And once it does, everything can change faster than you imagined. Which leads to the final realization that changes everything moving forward. And this is where everything you have heard turns into a decision. Because the pattern is not just something you observe, it confronts you. It asks where you are right now within your own unfinished story. Are you at the beginning, somewhere in the middle, or near completion? Because most people misread the moment they are actually standing in. They assume nothing is happening when they do not see visible results. They assume the process has failed when progress is not obvious. But the pattern reveals something that completely changes that perspective. The sixth moment almost always looks exactly like the first five. No visible difference, no clear sign, no evidence of anything shifting. It feels repetitive, exhausting, and dangerously close to giving up completely. And that is exactly where most people choose to walk away. Not because they are far from breakthrough, but because they are close. Close enough that the next step would change everything instantly. But they stop, convinced that nothing is ever going to happen. They interpret silence as absence when it may be alignment in progress. They interpret delay as denial when it may be preparation for completion. Because in every example, the pattern remains consistently the same. The breakthrough does not arrive gradually. It arrives at completion. It arrives at the moment the cycle reaches its intended final point. And until that moment, everything can look exactly the same outside. Which means your current situation may not reflect your actual progress. You may be closer than you think, even if nothing appears different. And that realization changes how you respond to the moment you are in. Because instead of quitting, you begin to recognize where you stand. You begin to understand that stopping early guarantees an unfinished outcome. But continuing aligns you with something that is already moving forward. And if the pattern has been consistent from beginning until now, then there is no reason to believe it suddenly stops with you. Because the same structure that governs creation still governs completion today, which means your story is not random. It is part of that design. And if that is true, then there is only one decision left. Do not walk away before the seventh, because everything changes there.